Okay, I am going to try deliver notes to a computer for the first time in my life. So let's take our first crack at lecture notes, chapter 23, Living in a World at War, 1939 to 1945. And I always start by talking about the years. 1939 is the year World War II begins, not for the United States, but for the world. And the beginning of the war starts with Hitler's invasion of Poland. Okay, the war ends in 1945. Germany surrenders in May of 1945, and the Japanese surrender in August of 1945. All right, the first slide is a slide that I added, and I'm only going to go through a few slides. I hope to never lecture more than 15 to 20 minutes in a day. All right, so I wanted to add a slide on important U.S. foreign policy themes and terms of the 1920s and 1930s that you need to know. All right, the first one, the Washington Naval Conference disarmament. First of all, this is 1921. It's not written in the notes. And also, the notes are already going to be shared with you. If you want to print them and take notes as we go, that's perfect by me. All right, so the Washington Naval Conference is also called the Washington Naval Disarmament Conference. Disarmament means to get rid of or reduce your number of weapons. Okay. There's something known as the Four Power and the Five Power Act. The Four Power Act was signed by the U.S., Great Britain, Japan, and France in December of 1921, and just talked about how those four countries would be consulted if there's any controversy between two of them in any Pacific question, meaning Pacific Ocean question. The Five Power Act is a much better known one. It's also called the Five Power Naval Limitation Treaty, which was signed by the U.S., Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy in February of 1922 in Washington, D.C. That's why it's called the Washington Naval Conference. And it was actually overseen by the United Nations, of which the United States never joined. However, the Washington Naval Conference we were part of. The Five Power Act, or Five Power Naval Limitation Treaty, is something that was signed again by Great Britain, United States, Japan, France, and Italy. And what this did is it set limits on the tonnage of warships each power could have. The tons the U.S. could have was 5 each, or the ratios of ships, and there's lots of different ways to look at this, but the two main powers were the U.S. and Great Britain. Third on the list was Japan, and France and Italy were fourth and fifth. Okay? And what this tried to do was halt any post-World War I race in building warships. Okay? It also necessitated the scrapping of certain numbers of ships from each nation. Something I do want to point out, and I'll point this out with some of these other issues on this slide, this was really never followed, and there was no teeth to this. Especially Japan said the heck with it and just started building up their navy anyways. Okay? You'll see I have a clickable link there to an article in the Encyclopedia Britannica that explains this in more detail. All right, the next one, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This was in 1928. And Kellogg was a congressman from Minnesota. Briand was a leader in France. And they signed a pact that it was known as a non-aggression pact that would outlaw war forever. We look at it today and it's almost laughable that a bunch of countries signed a law that said we will outlaw war. They did this in 1928, hoping that would end all war. Obviously didn't happen. The next 3 bullet points, isolationism, neutrality, and pacifism, are 3 themes in U.S. history in the 1920s and 1930s in which the United States, I think, learned the wrong lessons from World War I. And I'm going to start with isolationism. Isolationism is just really keeping yourself away from other countries' affairs, and the U.S. really focused on this in the decades following World War I, mainly because they saw World War I as a terrible war that didn't solve any problems and killed a lot of people, which were all true. And so we decided to be isolationist, stay away from Europe. The next one is the neutrality issue. The Nye Committee came together in the 1930s, and actually we passed several neutrality acts saying we must remain neutral and not side with either of the belligerents, meaning the two sides at war. Okay, then I'm going to throw in Charles Lindbergh here and his America First Committee. which came out saying, let's worry about America and not any countries at war. And especially because Charles Lindbergh supported Hitler and Nazism in the 1930s, as did other Americans. He's not the only one. But that's where that comes in. And then pacifism, the last one, is really people who don't believe in war at all. And you started to see a rise in this. Obviously, we've talked about Quakers before, were pacifists, but there were other people in this country as well. And the one thing I want to end with in this whole slide is understand all of this foreign policy items from the 1920s and 1930s led America to be less prepared for war than maybe we should have been when World War II started to break out in the late 1930s in Europe. And again, learning the wrong lessons from World War I. World War I, we've talked about the reasons and causes for going to war are not good. The end outcome of the war are also not really good. If you remember, it punished Germany greatly, which helped lead to the Great Depression, the rise of Hitler, and the beginnings of World War II. So us being isolationist and neutral and pacifist and allowing Hitler to rise to power and start another great war were not good lessons, because most of us understand why we fought World War II. And we fought World War II to stop the aggression of Hitler and Germany and Japan. Very good reasons to go to war, but because we learned the wrong lessons from World War I, through all of these different foreign policy themes and ideas and acts between the wars, we probably made the war worse, in my opinion. Okay, preparedness and isolation. Getting back into your book notes here, 1939 to 1941. When Germany attacked Poland in September of 1939, Britain and then France declared war on Germany. Europe was at war, and Hitler really got the jump on everybody. When he invaded Poland, he signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin of Russia, saying they would not attack each other. This turned out to be very wrong for the Soviet Union, because all it did was allow Hitler to spread across Poland in what was known as the Blitzkrieg War, where they took over Poland in a matter of days, they surrendered, and they were all of a sudden at Russia's doorstep, which they would attack a year later. Neither Japan nor the United States intervened yet. Britain and France waited for an attack they knew would come, and it came very quick to France. Hitler invaded France shortly after. France surrendered, and for most of the war, France was under German and Hitler control. After that, the battle over Britain began, and Hitler's air war. And the Battle of Britain really is an air war between the German Luftwaffe and the RAF, or the Royal Air Force. Okay. Again, by the summer of 1940, Hitler was the master of Europe. Only Great Britain stood against Germany. 338,000 Allied troops evacuated the beaches of Dunkirk, which is a famous movie from last year that Hollywood released. But the remaining troops that were British and French escaped, went to England, and the main occupying force for the Allied forces for much of the war would be southern England. And that's where the U.S. would eventually go to. And that's when Germans launched the Blitz, which is the battle for Britain, and they had a big air war against the British. And Hitler fails to capture Britain. Many historians think he should have invaded right away when he had the upper hand, but he never did. And it allowed Britain to stay strong, and eventually America to join Britain and defeat Hitler. I'm going to stop there for today. We'll get into Lend-Lease and how America responded to the early part of the war.